June 30th, 1941. The village of Orsha, Western Soviet Union. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Dvina River as Oberst Heinrich Müller, commanding the 4th Panzer Division's reconnaissance battalion, studied the bridge through his field glasses. The Wehrmacht had been advancing for 8 days, and nothing could stop them. Poland had fallen in weeks, France in 40 days. Now the Soviet Union was crumbling under the precision of German Blitzkrieg. Behind Müller's position, 220 tanks and half-tracks of the 4th Panzer Division stretched for kilometres along the road, their engines idling, commanders impatient to continue the drive towards Smolensk. The bridge at Orsha represented the last obstacle before open tank country. Once across, the Panzers would have a clear run to Moscow, only 350 kilometres away. Intelligence reported minimal Soviet resistance. Scattered infantry, a few obsolete tanks, nothing that could stand against German steel and tactical excellence. Müller lowered his glasses and smiled. By tomorrow evening, they would be 50 kilometres deeper into Soviet territory. Within a month, Moscow would fall. The war would be over by Christmas. At precisely 4:15 p.m, Müller heard a sound he would never forget. A strange whooshing noise, like tearing fabric amplified 1,000 times, followed by a shrill whistling that made veteran soldiers instinctively dive for cover. Then the world exploded. The first salvo of 320 rockets arrived simultaneously, impacting across a 400-metre front in less than 10 seconds. The bridge at Orsha vanished in a massive fireball. The lead company of Panzer IV tanks simply ceased to exist. 14 vehicles transformed into burning wreckage before their crews could react. Half-tracks loaded with Panzer grenadiers were tossed into the air like toys, their infantry scattered and burning. Müller, thrown flat by the concussion, looked up to see something impossible. The entire bridgehead was on fire. Not the scattered, precise destruction of artillery, but apocalyptic devastation that reminded him of biblical descriptions of hellfire. Everything within the impact zone was burning, shredded, or both. Men who had survived Poland, France, and the Balkans were screaming in terror, not pain. Terror at a weapon that defied everything they understood about warfare. Before the smoke cleared, a second salvo arrived, then a third. In less than a minute, 960 rockets weighing 42 kilograms each had transformed the approach to Orsha into a killing ground that resembled the surface of the moon. The 4th Panzer Division, the cutting edge of the most modern military force in the world, had just encountered a weapon that would haunt German soldiers for the rest of the war. A weapon so terrifying that the mere sound of its approach could break veteran units. A weapon that German intelligence initially refused to believe existed. The Soviets called it the Katyusha, Little Katy, a diminutive nickname that belied its apocalyptic, destructive power. German soldiers called it Stalin's organ because of the distinctive sound of its rocket ripple fire, but they also called it the Heuler, the Howler and Vanyusha, and dozens of other names, all spoken in tones of fear and respect. This is the story of how a desperate Soviet weapon program, born from catastrophic military defeats, created a rocket artillery system that changed the nature of ground warfare forever. This is the story of the BM-13 Katyusha, and the day it broke Blitzkrieg. The origins of Soviet rocket artillery began not in desperation, but in innovation, years before the German invasion. In 1938, the Soviet military established a specialized research institute in Moscow dedicated to rocket propulsion technology. The Reaction Propulsion Scientific Research Institute, under the direction of engineer WWII, was tasked with developing practical military applications for solid-fuel rockets. The concept wasn't new. Rockets had been used in warfare since the Chinese invented them centuries earlier. The British had deployed Congreve rockets against Napoleon. But these early weapons were notoriously inaccurate, more useful for psychological effect than tactical application. What changed in the 1930s was materials science and manufacturing precision. Guivet's team understood that a rocket didn't need to be as accurate as a shell. It just needed to be cheap, simple, and deliverable in overwhelming numbers. The key innovation was the 132mm RS-132 rocket, a solid fuel projectile originally designed for aircraft use. The rocket was elegantly simple, a steel tube containing a mixture of nitrocellulose powder and other propellants, a simple percussion fuse, and 4.9 kilograms of high explosive. The rocket stabilized itself in flight through angled exhaust nozzles that induced spin, like a football. No complex guidance, no sophisticated fusing, just brutal simplicity. By 1939, the Soviets had successfully tested the RS-132 as an air-to-ground weapon, achieving acceptable accuracy when fired from fighters and ground attack aircraft. But aircraft deployment limited the weapon's availability. Ground forces needed their own rocket artillery, available in quantities that would be impossible with aircraft delivery. The solution came from Yuri Pobedonostsev, a relatively unknown engineer working in WWII's institute. In December 1938, Pobedonostsev proposed a radical concept. Mount multiple rocket rails on a truck chassis, allowing rapid fire of dozens of rockets in quick succession, then immediate relocation before enemy counter-battery fire could respond. The truck-mounted launcher would be cheap to produce, highly mobile, and capable of devastating area saturation that conventional artillery could never achieve. The first prototype, designated BM-13, was built in early 1939. The BM stood for Boyovaya Machina, combat vehicle. The 13 referred to the rocket caliber, 132 mm. The launcher consisted of 8 parallel, rails mounted on the bed of a ZIS-6 truck, a standard Soviet medium cargo vehicle. Each rail held 2 rockets, stacked vertically, for a total capacity of 16 projectiles. The entire battery could be fired in 7 to 10 seconds, delivering 78.4 kilograms of high explosive across a target area in less time than it took to say the words. Initial tests were promising. The rockets achieved ranges of 8,500 meters, with acceptable accuracy for area targets. More importantly, the launcher could be reloaded in roughly 10 minutes by a trained crew, and the truck could relocate immediately after firing, making it nearly impossible to suppress with counter-battery fire. But the Soviet military, in the middle of purges that had decimated the officer corps, was slow to appreciate the weapon's potential. A demonstration for senior artillery commanders in June 1939 impressed observers, but production orders were limited. The Red Army had thousands of conventional artillery pieces. Why invest in unproven rocket technology? Then came the Winter War with Finland, November 1939 to March 1940. Soviet forces, expecting easy victory against a small neighbour, instead encountered fierce resistance and catastrophic casualties. The Finns, outnumbered and outgunned, inflicted over 126,000 Soviet casualties through superior tactics, terrain knowledge, and defensive preparation. Soviet artillery, effective against concentrated targets, struggled against dispersed Finnish positions hidden in forests and bunkers. The Red Army needed a weapon that could saturate areas quickly, destroying defensive positions before Finnish troops could take cover. In February 1940, 3 BM-13 prototypes were rushed to the Karelian front for field testing. The results were dramatic. Finnish positions that had withstood days of conventional artillery bombardment were obliterated in minutes by rocket salvos. More significantly, the psychological effect was profound. Finnish soldiers, accustomed to artillery fire they could predict and survive, panicked when subjected to the terrifying sound and simultaneous impacts of rocket barrages. But the Winter War ended before large-scale deployment was possible. The prototypes were returned to Moscow, and once again, production priorities shifted elsewhere. The Soviet military, focusing on modernizing tank and aircraft forces, allocated limited resources to experimental weapons. By June 1941, when Germany invaded, only a handful of BM-13 launchers existed, most still in testing. The German invasion, Operation Barbarossa, was the largest military operation in history. 3 million German soldiers, 3,600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft smashed across the Soviet border on June 22, 1941. Within hours, the Red Army was reeling. Within days, entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Within weeks, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were dead or captured, along with thousands of tanks and aircraft. The speed and violence of the German advance shocked Soviet leadership. Stalin, who had ignored warnings of the impending attack, initially refused to believe the scale of the disaster. By the time he accepted reality, German panzers were driving deep into Soviet territory, their Blitzkrieg tactics overwhelming Soviet defences that hadn't been prepared for such speed and coordination. Traditional Soviet responses weren't working. Counterattacks were shattered by German air superiority and superior tactics. Defensive positions were simply bypassed by fast-moving panzer columns. Artillery, laboriously positioned to defend specific sectors, was overrun before it could be effective or relocated. The Red Army needed weapons that could respond quickly to German breakthroughs, that could be deployed rapidly, and that could deliver devastating firepower without the logistics of conventional artillery. In this desperate context, someone remembered the BM-13 prototype sitting in a Moscow warehouse. On June 28, 1941, only 6 days after the invasion began, the Soviet State Defense Committee issued an emergency order. All available BM-13 launchers were to be organized into a special experimental battery and sent immediately to the Western Front. The battery, designated Battery 41 of the 20th Guards Mortar Regiment, consisted of 7 BM-13 launchers, each mounted on a ZIS-6 truck chassis. The battery had 112 rockets total, 16 per launcher. The crews, hastily trained, had less than 2 days of practice before being sent to the front. Command was given to Captain Ivan Flyarov, a 29-year-old artillery officer with no experience in rocket weapons. His orders were simple: find German concentrations, destroy them, learn what works. On June 30th, Flyarov's battery arrived in the area of Orsha, where German forces were preparing to cross the Dvina River. German reconnaissance had reported Soviet activity in the area, but nothing to delay the advance. The 4th Panzer Division was ordered to secure the bridge and continue the drive towards Smolensk. Flyarov positioned his 7 launchers in a forest clearing approximately 5 kilometers from the bridge, carefully concealed from air observation. He waited until the maximum number of German vehicles were concentrated at the bridgehead, then gave the order to fire. The sound of 112 rockets launching nearly simultaneously was unlike anything heard before on any battlefield. A tearing, shrieking roar that could be heard for kilometers. The rockets, trailing smoke and fire, arced across the afternoon sky in a pattern that looked like dozens of shooting stars. German soldiers, watching the approaching projectiles, had approximately 5 seconds to realize what was happening before impact. The effect was catastrophic. The 42-kilogram warheads exploded across a 400-meter front, each rocket creating a blast radius of 15 meters and spraying shrapnel for 50 meters. The overlapping explosions created a zone of total destruction. Tanks were knocked out by near misses that damaged tracks and optics. Half-tracks were punctured by shrapnel that killed crews and passengers. Infantry in the open were shredded. The bridge, struck by multiple direct hits, collapsed into the river. But beyond physical destruction was psychological trauma. German soldiers who had faced artillery fire before had never experienced simultaneous mass impact. Conventional artillery fire arrived in sequential rounds, allowing soldiers to take cover between impacts, to estimate where the next shell would land, to feel some measure of control. The Katyusha eliminated that control. One moment, there was nothing. The next, the entire world was exploding. No warning, no chance for evasion, just instant overwhelming violence across a massive area. Flyarov's battery fired twice more, then immediately relocated, engines already running. By the time German counter-battery radar identified the launch position and directed return fire, the trucks were already 3 kilometers away, hidden in another forest. The attack at Orsha delayed the 4th Panzer Division for 3 days. Not because of physical damage alone, though that was significant, but because German commanders, confronted with an unknown weapon of terrifying power, proceeded with extreme caution. Reconnaissance aircraft were diverted to search for rocket launchers. Infantry was sent ahead to clear potential firing positions. The confident, rapid advance that characterized Blitzkrieg became cautious and measured. News of the new Soviet weapons spread rapidly through German forces. Initial reports described multi-barrel rocket launchers of devastating power, mobile, almost impossible to locate before firing, capable of destroying entire companies in seconds. German intelligence, skeptical of such claims, assumed the reports were exaggerated, typical overstatement from frontline troops. Then more reports arrived. Different sectors, different armies, all describing the same weapon. The distinctive sound, the simultaneous mass impact, the psychological terror. Within 2 weeks of the Orsha attack, German High Command had compiled enough information to issue a formal intelligence bulletin. Soviet forces were deploying truck-mounted rocket launchers in increasing numbers. The weapons should be considered a high-priority threat. All units were ordered to report sightings immediately. The problem was finding them. The BM-13 launchers were specifically designed for shoot-and-scoot tactics. A typical firing sequence took less than 15 minutes. Arrive at pre-selected position, aim the launcher by adjusting the truck's position, fire all rockets in 7 to 10 seconds, relocate immediately. By the time German forces could respond, the launchers were kilometers away. Aerial reconnaissance proved nearly useless. The launchers looked like standard cargo trucks when not firing. They travelled in small groups, often at night, using secondary roads and forest tracks. They were hidden during the day under camouflage nets in forests or inside barns. Even when spotted, they were indistinguishable from the thousands of other Soviet vehicles moving behind the front lines. German counter-battery fire, highly effective against conventional Soviet artillery, was helpless against an enemy that fired and vanished in minutes. Soviet production priorities shifted immediately. The emergency order from the State Defense Committee in June 1941 had called for mass production of BM-13 launchers. By August 1941, multiple factories were converting production lines. The Voronezh Comintern factory, previously building agricultural machinery, was retooled to manufacture rocket rails and launchers. The compressor factory in Moscow began producing rockets. The ZIS Auto Works increased truck production to provide chassis. By September 1941, production reached 50 launches per month. By November, 100 per month. By early 1942, 300 per month. The Soviets were building rocket launchers faster than the Germans could destroy them. The rockets themselves were even easier to mass produce. Unlike artillery shells, which required precise machining and complex fusing mechanisms, the RS-132 rocket was essentially a steel tube filled with propellant. Quality control was minimal. Many rockets had visible welding flaws, rough finishes and inconsistent dimensions. None of it mattered. The rocket didn't need to be precise. It just needed to launch, fly approximately 8 kilometers, and explode. Soviet factories met these standards easily. By late 1941, rocket production exceeded 100,000 per month. The organizational structure also evolved. The Soviets quickly realized that rocket artillery required different tactics than conventional artillery. In September 1941, the Red Army established the Guards Mortar Units, a separate branch dedicated exclusively to rocket artillery. The designation Guards was honorific, typically reserved for elite units. Its use for rocket artillery reflected the weapon's importance and the secrecy surrounding it. Guards mortar regiments were organized into batteries of 4 to 6 launchers each, supported by ammunition trucks, reconnaissance teams, and security elements. The entire unit was designed for mobility. Everything was truck-mounted. Rockets were preloaded in wooden crates that could be rapidly transferred to launchers. Crews were trained to reload under fire, to navigate at night, to fight as infantry if necessary. More importantly, Guards mortar units operated independently of conventional artillery command. They received targeting information directly from front headquarters and chose their own firing positions. This flexibility allowed rapid response to German breakthroughs and concentration against high-value targets. The Germans began encountering Katyushas across the entire Eastern Front. August 1941, outside Smolensk. October 1941, defending Moscow. November 1941, during the siege of Leningrad. Each encounter followed the same pattern. The distinctive sound, mass simultaneous impact, devastating destruction, and the launcher vanishing before retaliation. German infantry developed deep psychological fear of the weapon. The sound alone could trigger panic. Veteran soldiers who had weathered artillery barrages without flinching would dive for any available cover when they heard the Katyusha's shriek. Officers reported men refusing to advance through areas where Katyushas had fired, even hours after the attack. Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt, serving with the 161st Infantry Division outside Moscow, wrote in a letter captured later, "We call them Stalin's organs because of the sound, like a church organ played by a madman. But there's nothing holy about them. When you hear that sound, you know that somewhere nearby, men are about to die. Maybe it will be you. Maybe it will be the company next to you. You can't predict it. You can't defend against it. You just pray the rockets land somewhere else. The worst part is afterward. The screaming. Artillery leaves recognizable wounds. These rockets shred men into pieces you can't identify. I've seen soldiers I've known for 2 years reduced to red mist and scattered body parts. You can't even bury them properly." We found one of our officers, or what was left of him, hanging from a tree, 30 meters from where he'd been standing. The explosion had simply thrown pieces of him into the branches. German forces tried various countermeasures. Radar units attempted to track rocket trajectories back to launch points, but the short flight time and dispersion pattern made this nearly impossible. Aircraft were assigned to hunt Katyusha batteries, but the launchers were too mobile and well camouflaged. Special anti-rocket patrols probed behind Soviet lines, looking for launcher concentrations, but these missions were suicide in areas where Soviet forces controlled the territory. The most effective German response was simply trying to advance faster than Soviet rocket units could reposition. Keep moving, don't concentrate vehicles, don't provide stationary targets, but this conflicted with fundamental Blitzkrieg doctrine, which relied on concentrated armoured formations to achieve breakthrough and exploitation. The Katyusha forced German commanders into impossible choices: concentrate forces for attack and risk devastating rocket strikes, disperse forces for safety and lose combat effectiveness. The Battle of Moscow in December 1941 showcased the Katyusha's strategic impact. As German forces exhausted themselves trying to encircle the Soviet capital, fresh Soviet armies counterattacked from Siberia. These forces included 36 Guards mortar regiments, over 500 rocket launchers, the largest concentration deployed to that point. The Soviets employed mass Katyusha strikes as the opening phase of their counter-offensive. In sectors where attacks were planned, rocket batteries would fire from multiple positions simultaneously, saturating German defensive positions with thousands of rockets in minutes. The psychological effect broke German units that were already exhausted and demoralized by the failed offensive and brutal winter conditions. General Lieutenant Gotthard Heinrici, commanding the 43rd Army Corps defending southwest of Moscow, reported to headquarters. The Russian rocket weapons are more demoralizing than effective in pure casualty terms, though casualties are certainly significant. But they create panic in men who have otherwise shown exemplary courage. The sound is distinctive and terrifying. When that sound is heard, men abandon positions, flee to rear areas, and refuse to return even under threat of punishment. I've seen entire companies break and run when rockets land kilometers away. We've had to establish special detachments to round up soldiers who flee during rocket attacks. The weapon has psychological power beyond its physical destructive capability. The German winter defeats of 1941-42 were caused by many factors: Soviet numerical superiority, German logistical failures, brutal weather, strategic overextension. But the Katyusha played its part, degrading German defensive cohesion and enabling Soviet breakthroughs that would have been far more costly without rocket artillery support. By spring 1942, the Soviets had learned valuable lessons about optimal Katyusha employment. The most effective tactic was massed fire. Individual batteries firing from single positions were impressive but limited. Multiple batteries firing from different positions on the same target simultaneously created an apocalyptic effect that shattered even veteran units. The Soviets developed the concept of the fire strike, concentrating all available rocket artillery in a sector for a single massive bombardment. During the defense of Sevastopol in June 1942, Soviet commanders organized a fire strike using 72 BM-13 launchers, 1,152 rockets total, targeted on German assault positions. The barrage lasted less than 2 minutes but delivered 48 tons of high explosive across a 1,200-metre front. The German 22nd Infantry Division, preparing to attack, suffered over 800 casualties before their assault even began. The attack was cancelled. German forces also developed grudging respect for Katyusha tactics. After-action reports noted that Soviet rocket artillery was employed with increasing sophistication. Early war Katyusha strikes had often been poorly aimed, fired at area targets with minimal intelligence. By 1942, Soviet forward observers were directing fire with precision, striking headquarters, artillery positions, supply depots, and troop concentrations with devastating accuracy. The Germans discovered that Soviet forces often left Katyusha batteries in place longer than expected, firing multiple salvos from the same position. This violated shoot-and-scoot doctrine but allowed for sustained bombardment. The Soviets had calculated that German counter-battery response took long enough that multiple salvos were possible, before relocation was necessary. German artillery learned to fire immediate suppression missions at likely Katyusha positions, hoping to catch launchers before they could relocate. Sometimes it worked. More often, the launchers were already gone. The technological evolution of Soviet rocket artillery continued throughout 1942. The BM-13 launcher was joined by new variants. The BM-8, mounting smaller 82mm rockets, sacrificed warhead size for increased numbers. A single BM-8 launcher could fire 48 rockets, creating even denser saturation patterns. The BM-31, mounting massive 300mm rockets, sacrificed quantity for destructive power. Each rocket weighed 91.5 kilograms and could demolish fortified structures with single hits. These heavy rockets were specifically designed for reducing German defensive positions during Soviet offensives. Perhaps most feared was the BM-13-16, an improved version mounting 16 rails instead of 8, doubling the firepower. A single salvo from this launcher put 32 rockets downrange, delivering over 156 kilograms of high explosive in less than 10 seconds. Soviet industry, despite catastrophic losses of territory and production capacity, maintained and increased rocket production throughout the war. Factories evacuated from Ukraine and Belarus to the Urals continued production without significant interruption. By late 1942, the Soviets were producing over 3,000 launchers per month and over 3 million rockets annually. These numbers dwarfed German production of comparable weapons. Germany did develop its own rocket artillery. The Nebelwerfer, multiple barrel rocket launcher systems that use chemical warfare delivery mechanisms adapted for high explosive rockets. The Nebelwerfer was effective, but German production never approached Soviet numbers. By 1943, the Red Army had over 700 Guards mortar regiments. The Germans had approximately 100 Nebelwerfer battalions. The disparity in availability meant that Soviet forces could use rocket artillery liberally, while German forces had to conserve their limited rocket units for critical situations. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 represented the apex of Katyusha effectiveness. The Germans, seeking to regain initiative on the Eastern Front, concentrated nearly 3,000 tanks and assault guns for Operation Citadel, a massive pincer attack against the Kursk salient. Soviet intelligence, aware of German intentions through multiple sources, prepared an elaborate defense. Over 1.3 million soldiers, 3,600 tanks, 20,000 artillery pieces, and 920 Katyusha launchers were positioned in defensive belts dozens of kilometers deep. The Soviet plan called for wearing down the German offensive through defense in depth, then launching a devastating counteroffensive once German forces were exhausted. Katyushas would play a central role in both phases. On July 5, 1943, as German forces prepared their assault, Soviet forces launched a preemptive artillery barrage. The bombardment included massive Katyusha strikes on German assembly areas, catching tanks and infantry in the open as they prepared to attack. Hauptmann Erich Schneider, commanding a company of Panzer IVs in the 3rd Panzer Division, survived the initial barrage. We were in formation, engines idling, waiting for the attack order. Then we heard that sound. Some of the new men didn't recognize it. The veterans knew. Within seconds, our assembly area was hell. Rockets landed among the tanks, the explosions so close together they sounded like continuous thunder. 3 of my tanks were knocked out immediately, not destroyed but damaged enough to be combat ineffective. Tracks blown off, optics shattered, external equipment torn away. The infantry supporting us suffered worse. They had no protection. Entire squads ceased to exist. The men who survived were in shock, unable to function. We advanced anyway, but our company, which should have had 14 operational tanks and a full infantry platoon, crossed the start line with 9 tanks and perhaps 30 infantry. Before we even engaged the enemy, we had lost a third of our strength. Throughout the Battle of Kursk, Katyushas hammered German concentrations. Every time German forces massed for an attack, rocket salvos disrupted formations and inflicted casualties. Every time German tanks broke through Soviet defensive lines, Katyushas struck from unexpected directions, forcing the Germans to disperse and lose momentum. The psychological impact remained profound. German soldiers, even veterans of years of Eastern Front combat, described Katyusha strikes in terms of supernatural terror. The weapon seemed designed not just to kill, but to break the will to fight. Soviet tactics at Kursk also demonstrated sophisticated coordination between rocket artillery and other forces. Katyusha strikes would often be synchronized with air attacks and conventional artillery. German forces, seeking cover from rockets, would emerge to face aircraft or artillery shells, or Katyushas would fire immediately after conventional artillery, catching Germans who thought the bombardment was over. The Germans lost approximately 500 tanks and assault guns at Kursk, along with nearly 200,000 casualties. Not all from Katyushas, certainly, but rocket artillery contributed significantly to degrading German combat effectiveness and preventing the breakthrough that Operation Citadel had been designed to achieve. After Kursk, German forces never regained strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. Soviet offensives, supported by ever-increasing numbers of rocket launchers, drove westward. The Red Army that crossed into Eastern Europe in 1944 included over 2,000 Guards mortar regiments, representing over 10,000 rocket launchers of all types. German forces retreating through Ukraine, Belarus and Poland faced Katyusha strikes daily. The distinctive sound became the audio signature of German defeat. Soviet forces used rockets for every conceivable purpose. Breaking German defensive lines, disrupting counterattacks, destroying supply depots, terrorizing rear area installations, even psychological warfare. Sometimes rockets were fired at empty areas just to create panic and force German forces to waste time and resources responding to phantom threats. The final Soviet offensives of 1944 and 1945 opened with Katyusha barrages of unprecedented scale. The Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945 began with a bombardment involving over 40,000 rockets fired in the opening hours. The final assault on Berlin included Katyusha strikes that turned entire city districts into moonscapes. German survivors of these final battles described the Katyusha as the sound of defeat, inevitable, unstoppable, the physical manifestation of Soviet industrial and numerical superiority. Lieutenant Kurt Meyer, defending Berlin in April 1945, left a diary that was recovered after the war. The Russians fire those rockets constantly now, day and night. We don't even react anymore. What's the point? You hear the sound, you take cover if cover's available. If not, you wait to see if you're still alive when the explosions stop. Most times, you survive. Sometimes you don't. It's random. Like everything else in this war has become. We've lost. We all know it. But the war continues. And every day, those rockets fall. Stalin's organs playing the funeral march for the Reich. The final statistics of Katyusha production and employment defy easy comprehension. The Soviets produced approximately 10,000 BM-13 launchers during the war, plus thousands of other rocket artillery variants. Total rocket production exceeded 12 million rockets. Total tonnage of explosive delivered by rocket artillery exceeded 2 million tons. The weapon that began as an experimental prototype in 1939 became one of the war's most produced and deployed artillery systems. Its impact extended beyond simple destructive capability. The Katyusha forced fundamental changes in German tactics. Blitzkrieg doctrine, based on concentrated armoured formations achieving rapid breakthrough, became increasingly difficult to execute when any concentration attracted devastating rocket fire. German forces learned to disperse, to move at night, to avoid predictable positions. All of this reduced combat effectiveness and slowed operations. The psychological impact was equally significant. German soldiers feared Katyushas more than almost any other Soviet weapon. The sound alone created panic. Veterans who faced them described lasting psychological trauma. Post-war medical research on German POWs identified symptoms consistent with what would now be called PTSD, specifically related to Katyusha experiences. The weapon also influenced post-war military development. Every major military in the world studied Soviet rocket artillery and developed similar systems. The American T-34 Calliope, the British Land Mattress, even the German Nebelwerfer were all influenced by or responses to the Katyusha. Modern, multiple launch rocket systems, from the American M270 MLRS to the Russian BM-30 Smerch, trace their lineage directly to the BM-13. In 1945, at a victory parade in Moscow, captured German officers were forced to watch Guards mortar regiments pass in review, their BM-13 launchers mounted on Lend-Lease American trucks. Generaloberst Heinz Guderian, architect of German Blitzkrieg doctrine and one of history's greatest armour tacticians, reportedly said to a fellow prisoner, "That weapon broke us." Not alone, of course, but it contributed more than historians will ever acknowledge. We designed Blitzkrieg around concentrated power at decisive points. Concentration became suicide when they could drop thousands of rockets on any concentration in minutes. We had to disperse, and dispersed forces could not achieve breakthrough. Their rocket artillery didn't defeat us tactically in individual battles. It defeated us strategically by forcing us to fight in ways that negated our advantages. That truck-mounted launcher, crude as it was, represented something we never understood until too late. Industrial warfare isn't about elegance or precision. It's about overwhelming material application. They built 10,000 of those launchers. We could never have matched that production even if we'd started in 1939. They won the war in their factories before it was fought in the field. The distinctive sound of the Katyusha would echo through Cold War conflicts. Soviet rocket artillery appeared in Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, Afghanistan. Each time, that same shrieking roar preceded devastation. Each time, soldiers facing it for the first time experienced the same terror that German soldiers had felt at Orsha in 1941. At the Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow, a restored BM-13 launcher sits among displays of Soviet military equipment. Its placard lists technical specifications, production numbers, and a quote from Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who commanded Soviet forces throughout the war's greatest battles. The Katyusha was the people's weapon. Simple enough for any factory to build, simple enough for any soldier to operate, devastating enough to break the fascist invaders. When I heard that sound, I knew we would win. When the fascists heard that sound, they knew they would lose. The P-47 Thunderbolt and the BM-13 Katyusha, American industrial muscle and Soviet mass production, created in different ways by different philosophers, both sharing a common characteristic. They were weapons of overwhelming material superiority, designed not for elegance but for mass destruction. They were the sound of Axis defeat. For German soldiers on both fronts, these weapons represented the same terrible reality. They were fighting enemies who could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them, who could produce weapons in quantities Germany could never match, whose industrial capacity had been underestimated catastrophically. On June 30th, 1941, at Orsha, the first Katyusha salvo announced that Blitzkrieg had met its match. The concentrated power that had swept across Europe would shatter against Soviet depth and industrial capacity. The Panzers would still advance for another year. But the sound of Stalin's organ had spoken, and the German soldier who heard it understood, perhaps for the first time, that this war would not end by Christmas. The tactical revolution forced by the Katyusha extended far beyond simple fear. By mid-1942, German operational planning had to account for Soviet rocket artillery in ways that fundamentally altered how they conducted warfare. Oberst Hermann Balck, commanding the 11th Panzer Division during operations south of Stalingrad, discovered this reality in August 1942. His division, one of the Wehrmacht's finest, was tasked with exploiting a breakthrough in Soviet lines near Kalash. Standard doctrine called for concentrating the division's 140 tanks and motorized infantry into a tight spearhead that would drive deep into Soviet rear areas, spreading chaos and cutting supply lines. Balck positioned his forces in an assembly area overnight, planning to attack at dawn. At 4:30 a.m., before sunrise, his division was struck by a coordinated Katyusha barrage from 3 separate batteries. Over 200 rockets impacted across the assembly area in less than 30 seconds. The physical damage was significant. 11 tanks damaged, though only 3 were total losses. 23 trucks and half-tracks destroyed or disabled. But the tactical impact was catastrophic. The tight formation Balck had organized for maximum breakthrough power was now scattered across several square kilometers. Units had dispersed to escape the bombardment and couldn't be quickly reassembled. The attack, scheduled for 5 a.m., was delayed until 9 a.m., while commanders located their units and reformed. By then, Soviet forces had reinforced the sector. The breakthrough opportunity was lost. Balck later wrote in his memoirs that this single incident taught him more about modern warfare than any staff college. The operational tempo that made Blitzkrieg effective required concentration, but concentration had become the greatest vulnerability. German forces adapted by operating in smaller, more dispersed formations, but this reduced their combat power at the point of contact. The dilemma was unsolvable. The Soviet rocket artillery doctrine evolved into something approaching science by 1943. The Guards mortar units developed detailed fire tables that calculated optimal rocket salvos for different target types. Attacking infantry in the open required wide dispersal patterns with impact fuses. Fortified positions required concentration patterns with delay fuses that allowed rockets to penetrate before detonation. Vehicle concentrations required mixed fusing to catch vehicles and crews simultaneously. Captain Nikolai Kolosov, a battery commander who survived the war and later taught at the Frunze Military Academy, described the planning process in a 1960s lecture that was declassified decades later. We approached each target scientifically. Intelligence would identify enemy positions, concentrations, or movements. We would calculate the optimal firing position based on range, terrain, and escape routes. We would determine the number of rockets needed. A company of infantry in the open, perhaps 32 rockets. A tank company in assembly, 48 to 64 rockets depending on dispersion. A headquarters complex, perhaps 80 rockets to ensure saturation. The mathematics were simple but effective. Each rocket had a lethal radius of approximately 15 meters and a casualty radius of 50 meters. By calculating impact dispersion patterns, we could determine exactly how many rockets would guarantee coverage of any target area. Then we would add 25% more, because overwhelming force was always preferable to insufficient fire. The Soviets also developed sophisticated deception tactics. Dummy Katyusha positions would be established with wooden mock-ups that resembled launchers from aerial reconnaissance. German aircraft would waste ordnance attacking empty positions while real launchers operated elsewhere. Radio deception created phantom rocket batteries, causing German forces to divert resources against threats that didn't exist. In particularly clever operations, the Soviets would fire Katyushas from one position, quickly relocate, then fire artillery from the original position to simulate counter-battery response, hoping German forces would assume the rocket battery had been destroyed. The Germans tried desperately to develop effective countermeasures beyond simple dispersal. Specialized Nebelwerfer battalions were positioned to provide counter-rocket fire, attempting to catch Soviet launchers during their vulnerable reload phase. This occasionally worked, but Soviet battery commanders learned to rotate firing positions and never reload in the same location they had fired from. German intelligence officers interrogated captured Katyusha crews extensively, trying to understand operational procedures and identify vulnerabilities. One interrogation report from October 1943 revealed the frustrating effectiveness of Soviet security measures. The captured sergeant knew only his battery's immediate chain of command, not regimental or divisional structures. He knew current firing positions, but not future ones, which were communicated only immediately before movement. He knew that his battery was one of many in the sector, but not how many or their locations. The compartmentalization made comprehensive intelligence nearly impossible. Even when German forces captured intact Katyushas, which happened rarely because crews were trained to destroy their launchers, if capture was imminent, the intelligence value was limited. The weapons were so simple that German engineers learned nothing they didn't already know. The launcher was just angled rails. The rockets were just solid fuel tubes. There were no secret technologies to exploit, no vulnerabilities to discover. The weapon's effectiveness came from mass production and tactical employment, neither of which German forces could counter. The winter of 1942-43, encompassing the Stalingrad disaster, saw Katyushas employed in their ultimate strategic role, supporting the encirclement and destruction of an entire German army. The Sixth Army, trapped in Stalingrad with over 250,000 soldiers, faced constant rocket bombardment as Soviet forces tightened the noose. Generaloberst Friedrich Paulus, commanding the doomed army, reported to headquarters that Soviet rocket artillery was firing up to 20,000 rounds daily into the pocket. This number was likely exaggerated by men under extreme stress, but captured Soviet records indicate that between 50 and 100 Katyusha launchers were assigned to the Stalingrad sector specifically to bombard the encircled Germans. The psychological warfare effect was deliberate. Soviet commanders understood that destroying the Sixth Army through starvation and attrition was more valuable than quick annihilation. The longer the Germans held out, the more resources Germany would waste trying to relieve them, the more their defeat would damage German morale. Katyusha strikes were timed for maximum psychological impact. Barrages during mealtimes, when soldiers were congregated. Strikes during the night, denying rest. Saturation fire on medical facilities, killing wounded and destroying the few remaining sources of hope. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Hoffmann, whose diary was found on his corpse after Stalingrad fell, recorded entries that illustrated the mental deterioration caused by constant rocket bombardment. December 18, 1942. The Russian rockets came again today. 3 times. We've stopped counting casualties. What's the point? There's nowhere to bury them anyway. The ground is frozen solid. We stack the bodies like cordwood and wait. Some of the men laugh when they hear the rockets now, not because anything is funny, because something has broken inside them. December the 26th, 1942. I heard the sound of the rockets and didn't move, stayed in my position. If they hit me, I'll be dead. If they don't, I'll still be here in this frozen hell. It doesn't matter anymore. Some part of me hopes the next salvo lands directly on me. At least it would be over. January 14th, 1943. The rockets have stopped. Not because the Russians are being merciful, because they're preparing the final assault. We have no ammunition left to resist, no food, no hope. The silence is worse than the rockets were. At least the rockets meant we were still considered worth killing. The encirclement and destruction of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad marked the psychological turning point of the Eastern Front. German soldiers could no longer believe in inevitable victory. And among the factors that broke the Sixth Army, the constant shriek of Katyushas and the random death they delivered played a role that Hoffman's diary captured. This wasn't a weapon. You could fight. It was a weapon you could only endure, and eventually endurance failed. The Soviet offensives of 1943 and 1944 showcased Katyusha employment at operational scale. Major attacks would be preceded by bombardments involving hundreds of launchers, firing thousands of rockets in coordinated waves. The Belarusian offensive in June 1944, Operation Bagration, began with a bombardment that involved over 400 Katyusha launchers, firing in the opening phase, delivering an estimated 15,000 rockets onto German positions in the first hour. General Heinz Guderian, by then Chief of the General Staff, received reports from Army Group Center describing the bombardment's effects. Entire defensive positions obliterated before infantry assault began. Communication networks destroyed. Command posts buried. Artillery batteries knocked out before they could provide defensive fire. The Soviet offensive, supported by this apocalyptic preparation, shattered Army Group Center in weeks, destroying 28 German divisions and inflicting over 400,000 casualties. The Katyusha barrage hadn't caused all those casualties directly, but it had created the conditions for catastrophic German defeat. German doctors treating casualties from Katyusha strikes noted unusual wound patterns compared to conventional artillery. The rocket warheads produced extremely high fragmentation densities, creating multiple small wounds rather than single large wounds. Soldiers caught in the open would be hit by dozens or even hundreds of small shrapnel fragments. The cumulative effect was often fatal, but even survivors required extensive treatment for numerous wounds. Medical facilities, already overwhelmed by the scale of casualties, struggled to treat wounded with 30 or 40 separate shrapnel wounds each. The strain on German medical resources contributed to overall casualty rates, as wounded soldiers who might have survived with prompt treatment died waiting for care. The Soviets also developed specialized Katyusha variants for specific roles. The BM-3112 heavy rocket launcher fired 300mm rockets with 28.9 kilogram warheads, designed specifically for demolishing German fortifications. A single hit from a BM-31 rocket could destroy a concrete bunker that would require dozens of conventional artillery shells. These heavy launchers were used extensively during the reduction of German defensive lines in Eastern Europe. In the Siege of Breslau in 1945, BM-31 batteries systematically destroyed the German fortifications that had been built to make the city impregnable. The light BM-8 launchers, mounting 82mm rockets, were used for harassment fire and quick strikes. Their lower weight meant they could operate in terrain that would bog down heavier launchers. Partisan units behind German lines received BM-8 launchers, using them to ambush German convoys and attack rear area installations. The psychological effect of rocket attacks deep behind the front lines was devastating to German morale. Soldiers could accept danger at the front, but attacks far behind the lines by weapons they associated with major offensives created a sense that nowhere was safe. German soldiers also developed fatalistic humor about Katyushas, the only psychological defense available. They called the rocket Stalin's pipe organ, Stalin's wind instruments, the howlers, and dozens of other nicknames. Jokes circulated about Katyushas being Soviet secret weapons developed by Russian scientists who were tone-deaf and decided to weaponize bad music. One persistent joke claimed that the rockets were actually filled with musical instruments, which explained the terrible noise, and the only casualties were from soldiers dying of embarrassment at the cacophony. The humour was black and desperate, but it served a purpose. Men who could joke about the weapon could function despite their fear. Men who couldn't joke often broke. German officers learned to distinguish between soldiers who had adapted psychologically to Katyusha attacks and those who hadn't. The ones who hadn't were quietly transferred to rear areas when possible. The ones who had adapted stayed at the front and taught new replacements how to survive. Surviving meant recognizing the sound immediately and taking cover instantly, understanding that the first seconds after hearing the launch determined whether you lived or died. It meant learning to identify the distance and direction of launches by sound, allowing you to estimate where rockets would land. It meant accepting that survival was partly luck and partly skill, and that sometimes luck ran out regardless of skill. It meant not thinking about the men who died in the last attack, and not thinking about whether you'd die in the next one, just existing in the narrow present between salvos. The Eastern European campaigns of 1944 saw Katyushas employed not just against military targets, but as terror weapons against German defensive positions in urban areas. The Siege of Budapest from December 1944 to February 1945 included extensive Katyusha strikes into German-held districts. Soviet forces deliberately fired into areas where German troops and Hungarian civilians were sheltering together, maximizing casualties and panic. The ethics of this employment were questionable by any standard. Katyushas were area weapons, incapable of precision. Firing them into cities guaranteed civilian casualties. Soviet commanders justified the tactic by arguing that German forces using civilian areas as defensive positions forfeited any protection those civilians might otherwise have had. German commanders accused Soviets of war crimes. Soviet commanders replied that the entire German invasion was a war crime. The rockets kept falling. Civilians died alongside soldiers. Historical judgment remains complicated. By early 1945, the Katyusha had evolved from experimental weapon to standard Soviet artillery piece, as common in Soviet arsenals as conventional howitzers. Training programs produced thousands of qualified crews annually. Ammunition stockpiles exceeded millions of rockets. Doctrine manuals codified optimal employment for every tactical situation. The weapon that had been a desperate improvisation in 1941 was now a mature, integrated component of Soviet military power. The final battles in Germany showcased the weapon's ultimate evolution. The assault on Berlin involved over 40,000 artillery pieces, including approximately 520 rocket launchers of all types. The bombardment that preceded the final assault on the Reichstag included Katyusha salvos that set entire city blocks ablaze. German defenders, mostly old men and teenage boys of the Volkssturm by this point, broke and ran when they heard the rockets coming. The experienced soldiers were long dead. The survivors hadn't been hardened by years of combat. They had been traumatized by it. The sound of Katyushas was the sound of the apocalypse. Lieutenant Klaus Fischer, 16 years old, commanding a Hitler Youth platoon in the defense of Berlin, surrendered to Soviet forces on April 28, 1945. His interrogation, preserved in Soviet archives, revealed the complete psychological dominance the weapon had achieved. They asked me why I surrendered. I told them I surrendered when I heard the rockets. They asked if my position was hit. I said no. They asked if I had ammunition. I said yes. They asked if I had orders to hold. I said yes. They asked again why I surrendered. I told them, when you hear that sound, you know you're going to die. Maybe not from these rockets. Maybe from the next salvo. Maybe from the assault that comes after. But you're going to die. I'm 16 years old. I've been in uniform for 3 months. I don't want to die for a Reich that's already dead. When the rockets started, I dropped my weapon and walked towards Soviet lines with my hands up. Half my platoon followed me. The other half probably died in the assault. I made the right choice. The weapon that achieved this level of psychological dominance had cost the Soviets relatively little to develop and produce. Total Soviet investment in rocket artillery development and production was less than 5% of their artillery budget. The return on that investment, measured in German casualties inflicted, German operations disrupted, and German psychological cohesion degraded, was extraordinary. Post-war analysis by both Soviet and Western military historians concluded that the Katyusha represented one of the most cost-effective weapon systems of the war. In the immediate post-war period, captured German officers and soldiers were extensively interviewed about their experiences and perceptions of Soviet weapons. The Katyusha consistently ranked as one of the most feared, alongside the T-34 tank and Soviet tactical aviation. Many veterans rated it as more psychologically impactful than either, because tanks could be fought with anti-tank weapons and aircraft could be avoided with air raid, shelters, but Katyushas appeared without warning and disappeared before retaliation. Generaloberst Gotthard Heinrici, considered one of Germany's best defensive commanders, stated in a 1947 interview that if he could eliminate one Soviet weapon system, he would choose the Katyusha over all others. His reasoning was tactical and psychological. Tanks we could stop with proper anti-tank defences. Aircraft we could counter with anti-aircraft artillery and fighters. The rocket launchers we never solved. They struck without warning, devastated positions, and vanished. More importantly, they created constant anxiety. Soldiers could never relax, never feel safe, even in rear areas. The psychological wear was cumulative and ultimately broke units that would have otherwise remained effective. The tactical surprise of June 1941 never diminished. Throughout the war, every time we heard that sound, men reacted with fear regardless of their experience or training. The weapon had psychological power that transcended its material effects. If I could have neutralized one Soviet capability, that would have been it. The Soviet military, recognizing the weapon's success, continued developing rocket artillery throughout the Cold War. The BM-13 Katyusha evolved into increasingly sophisticated systems. The BM-21 Grad, introduced in 1963, carried 40 rockets with improved range and accuracy. The BM-27 Uragan and BM-30 Smerch followed, each generation more capable than the last. The fundamental concept remained unchanged: mass mobile firepower, rapid engagement, quick displacement. Russia's modern rocket artillery forces trace direct lineage to those first BM-13 batteries that fired at Orsha in June 1941. The tactics, the doctrine, even some of the organizational structures remain essentially unchanged. What works doesn't need radical reinvention. Other nations, learning from Soviet experience, developed their own rocket artillery. The American M270 multiple launch rocket system, introduced in the 1980s, represented Western acknowledgement that the Soviets had been right about mass rocket firepower. The Chinese PHL-03, the Brazilian Astros II, the Israeli Lahat, dozens of systems worldwide, all descendants of Katyusha. In conflicts from Korea to Vietnam, from the Middle East to Afghanistan, the distinctive sound of multiple rocket launchers preceded attack and created the same fear it had in German soldiers decades earlier. Each generation of soldiers facing rocket artillery for the first time experienced the same psychological shock. The technology improved, but the fundamental terror of simultaneous mass impact remained constant. The Museum of the Great Patriotic War in Moscow displays a BM-13 launcher in a place of honor, surrounded by testimonials from veterans and captured German documents. One display case contains a letter from a German soldier found on his body after he was killed near Kursk. The letter, never mailed, was addressed to his wife in Bavaria. The translation, posted alongside the original German text, reads in part, "I don't fear death anymore. I've become numb to it. I've seen too many friends die, and I've accepted that my turn will come. What I fear is the sound. Those Russian rockets make a sound like nothing else. When you hear it, you know that in seconds the world will explode. Some men die instantly. Some die slowly, screaming as they bleed out from wounds no one can treat in time. Some go mad, running aimlessly until they collapse or are cut down. I've seen all of it. I've survived salvos that killed everyone around me. I don't know why. Luck, I suppose. God's will, perhaps, though I've stopped believing God pays attention to this place. I dream about the sound. Even when I'm awake, I sometimes think I hear it, and my heart races and I feel the terror grip me. The rockets haven't landed near my position in a week, but the fear never leaves. Other men feel the same. We don't talk about it. What would we say? That we're terrified of a weapon we can't fight? That we flinch at sounds that resemble rockets? That we've all considered shooting ourselves just to escape the waiting? We endure because we must. But I wanted you to know, if I don't return, that it wasn't enemy action that killed me. It was that sound, that terrible sound. One way or another, it kills us all. The letter was dated July 10th, 1943. The soldier was killed on July 12th. The Soviet after-action report from his sector noted heavy Katyusha employment on that date. Whether he died in a rocket barrage or in the assault that followed, whether he heard the sound one final time or was killed by something else entirely, the records don't specify. But his fear was realized. The sound he dreaded killed him, if not directly, then through the offensive it supported. His letter remains displayed in Moscow as testimony to the weapon's effectiveness, not because of the casualties it inflicted, though those were significant, but because of the fear it created, fear that persisted even when the weapon wasn't present, fear that broke men who had survived years of combat, fear that degraded military effectiveness as surely as destroyed equipment. Modern military doctrine recognizes what Soviet designers understood in 1938. Psychological impact is as important as physical destruction. A weapon that creates terror achieves effects beyond its material capabilities. The Katyusha was designed to kill enemy soldiers. Its greatest achievement was breaking their will to fight. The mathematics of destruction were straightforward. 16 rockets, 42 kilograms each, 672 kilograms of explosive per salvo, 7 seconds of fire, 10 minutes to reload. Numbers that could be calculated, analysed, compared to conventional artillery. But numbers didn't capture the experience. Numbers didn't explain why veterans broke. Numbers didn't account for the dreams, the anxiety, the cumulative psychological damage. German military efficiency, famous for its tactical excellence and operational sophistication, found no answer for a truck-mounted rocket launcher. The weapon violated German military aesthetics. It was crude, inaccurate, wasteful. German engineers could have built superior systems with better range, better accuracy, better reliability. They did build Nebelwerfers that were arguably better weapons, technically. But they never built enough, never employed them as systematically, never recognized that mass and mobility mattered more than precision. The Soviet approach was philosophically different. Good enough, produced in overwhelming numbers, delivered with maximum psychological impact. Perfection was irrelevant. Victory came from material superiority and willingness to use it without hesitation or restraint. Katyusha embodied this philosophy perfectly. On May 9, 1945, Victory Day in Moscow, as Soviet forces celebrated Germany's surrender, Guards mortar regiments paraded through Red Square. The BM-13 launchers, mounted on American Studebaker trucks supplied through Lend-Lease, rolled past the reviewing stands where Stalin and senior Soviet leadership stood. The crowds cheered the Katyushas as loudly as they cheered the tank formations, perhaps more loudly. These were the weapons that had broken the fascist invaders, that had avenged the catastrophic losses of 1941, that had carried Soviet fire to Berlin. Among the German prisoners watching the parade from forced labour details, many recognised the launchers. Some turned away. Others stared with expressions mixing fear and respect. The weapon that had haunted them through years of retreat was being celebrated by the enemy they had once dismissed as inferior. The reversal was complete. The Battle of Orsha on June 30th, 1941, where this story began, was a minor engagement in the vast scope of the Eastern Front. A few hundred casualties, a 3-day delay for one Panzer division, barely a footnote in military histories. But it was the first time German forces encountered a weapon they would never solve, never defeat, never escape. In 4 years, that weapon would help drive them back to Berlin and destroy the Wehrmacht as an effective fighting force. The Katyusha didn't defeat Germany alone. Soviet tanks, Soviet infantry, Soviet aircraft, Soviet partisans, Soviet production capacity, and the blood of over 20 million Soviet citizens all contributed to victory. But in the hierarchy of weapons that broke the Wehrmacht, the Katyusha holds a unique position. It was the weapon that made German soldiers fear Soviet firepower, the weapon that forced tactical adaptation, that reduced German combat effectiveness, the weapon whose sound signified Soviet material superiority, the weapon that, more than any other, represented the transformation of the Red Army from a force reeling from catastrophic defeats in 1941 to a force capable of smashing its way to Berlin. Oberst Heinrich Müller, whose observation of the bridge at Orsha opened this account, survived the war. He was captured by Soviet forces in 1945 and spent 5 years in a prisoner of war camp before being released. In 1963, he was interviewed by a West German military historian researching Soviet weapon systems. Asked about his most significant combat experience, Müller didn't mention tank battles or close infantry combat. He described June 30th, 1941. That was the day I realized we would lose the war. Not consciously, not in a way I could have articulated then. But somewhere deep in my mind, I knew. The Russians had something we didn't expect, couldn't counter, couldn't match. I'd heard our propaganda about Soviet inferiority, Soviet backwardness. I'd believed it. Then I saw what their supposedly inferior engineers had created. A weapon so simple it could be mass-produced in any factory, so effective it could destroy a company in seconds, so mobile it could strike and vanish before we could respond. I told myself it was lucky hit, that we'd develop countermeasures, that German superiority would prevail. But I never believed it completely. Every time I heard that sound afterward, and I heard it hundreds of times over the next 4 years, I remembered Orsha. I remembered the bridge exploding, the men screaming, the fear that gripped everyone, including me. And I knew. We were fighting an enemy who could replace losses faster than we could inflict them, who could produce weapons in quantities we couldn't match, who would bury us under steel and fire if we gave them time. We didn't give them time, they took it anyway. And the rockets kept coming. The thunder that began at Orsha never stopped until Berlin fell. That sound, that terrible sound, was the sound of our defeat. It just took 4 years for the end to arrive. The BM-13 Katyusha, developed in desperation, produced in quantity, employed with ruthless effectiveness, achieved what its designers intended. It delivered devastating firepower against German forces, but it achieved something more significant. It demonstrated that wars of industrial attrition are won by nations that can produce good enough weapons in overwhelming numbers, not by nations that produce perfect weapons in limited quantities. The German military machine, so impressive in its tactical excellence and operational sophistication, lost to an enemy willing to mass-produce crude but effective weapons and use them without restraint. The lesson was clear by 1945. The rockets had spoken, the Blitzkrieg was broken, and the sky belonged to those who controlled the means of production.